wrote a book called Making Love Again, and it was published in 2002. And it's the story of how Keith and I dealt with regaining intimacy after Keith became impotent for prostate cancer. And I wrote the book because there were no books written of people telling their stories. And as far as I know, there are still no couple who has shared so openly about their sexuality. But now I'm starting a website, and I'm going to continue because the story continues. And so we'll give you the information when that website is live, and so I'm going to do blogging about the continuation of our story because it didn't just stop once we were making love again. So with that, we'll tell you a little bit about our story and then lots of questions.
Virginia and I are not medical people. We're not trained medically. So our story is strictly from the layperson standpoint of how we reacted to something that became quite important in our life. And so the story actually begins when I'm 47 and my PSA is rising, my prostate-specific antigen is rising, and the doctors that picked it up on my annual medical started doing biopsies when my PSA reached about 7 or 8. So I was in my 4th decade of life. And when your PSA number is higher than your decade of life, that's alarming. And so ultimately I had surgery when it hit 14. They removed it, and I'm cancer-free. And for a lot of people, that's a really, really great milestone. However, the 2 years leading up to that, we were on a roller coaster. Because when you think of the term impotent, you look it up in the dictionary, it means ineffective, or you can't get the job done, the first 2 definitions. And when you think about that, I was in the peak of my career. I was vice president of an international company, and I was responsible for intellectual property, R&D, and I thought I was king of the world, and I did not want anybody to think of me as impotent. I did not want that word at all. I feared it. And then the other part of it is the third definition is the inability to achieve a usable erection. And frankly, that bothered me just as much as anything else, but I just did not want that word associated with me. So that was my first roller coaster dive down into what one might call depression, or in my case, being a pilot, suspected mild depression, because a diagnosis would have eliminated my flying, my pilot's license. So all of a sudden I'm starting to learn about what's going on here. So I did not want to have the surgery. Absolutely didn't.
I was horrified that he would consider not treating a cancer just for the sake of us having sex. And I said to him, you know, I can live without sex, but I can't live without you. I don't want you to die. And Keith would say,
well, that was my second deep dive, because all of a sudden I'm realizing that maybe I haven't been such a good sexual partner with my wife. It's really not that important anymore.
And at the time when I said that, I really did mean it, except I did then learn that that actually wasn't true. So anyway, Keith had his surgery, and as a result of the surgery, he did become impotent. And for 4 months, we had no intimacy. We didn't have sex at all. He couldn't get an erection, and we thought, well, it will come back. You know, we'll come. Just give it some time. And so after 4 months of nothing, we had an appointment with the chief of urology at the Mayo Clinic, who had done Keith's surgery. And during this appointment, Keith, you know, the doctor said, oh, you're doing good, your PSA is low, you're doing really good. And he said, yeah, except I still can't get an erection. And he said, well, you know, Keith, you can have an orgasm without getting an erection. And Keith said,
My response was, yep, I knew that. I really didn't, but
We leave the office, and we're in, if any of you have been in the mail, you know there's a lobby in front of the elevators. And I took Keith aside and I said, Keith, I didn't know you could have an orgasm without an erection. Why didn't you tell me this? We could have been making love all this time and we weren't doing anything. Why didn't you tell me? And he said,
my response was absolutely, I have no idea what this guy's talking about. And so you said to me, and I said, well, why don't you go back? Let's go back and
Yeah.
get information. I said, that's not going to happen. There's two things a man doesn't do. And first thing is he never asks for directions. And the second thing is we don't ask other men about sex. We just don't. Not in my life, anyhow.
I was horrified that he wouldn't even go back and ask his urologist about this, what seemed to me a really important piece of information. So we continued to not be intimate. And Keith and I had been we had sex a lot in our marriage, and so now all of a sudden we weren't touching at all. And so I'd been thinking about this, and we were going to take a trip out to Baltimore to see our son. He was in school at Johns Hopkins. And I thought, okay, the first night we stopped in Ohio, and we were going to go swimming in the swimming pool, and we got undressed, and I said, Keith, I don't want to go swimming. I want to make love. And I could feel Keith's body just get firm and tense. And I said, Keith, I'll do oral sex, and let's see if you can't have an orgasm. I'll do oral sex on you. No. And we had practiced oral sex in our marriage. It wasn't something unusual for us. But I said, no, I want to try this. And so I started to perform oral sex on Keith, and nothing was happening. And even before I started, I thought, if this doesn't work, things are going to be worse. Because now what's going to be left for us? And we had already been bickering and fighting and picking on each other. And so I performed oral sex, and it took a long time. And finally, Keith had an orgasm. And when that orgasm resided, he pulled me close and he said,
You've brought me back to life. I feel like a human again.
so.
I think I even had tears in my eyes. It was just such wonderful.
It was like, oh my gosh. So that was great. But we were still very, very fearful. And so all we knew in order to enjoy sex was to have oral sex, oral sex, oral sex.
Well, you got to be careful what you wish for. Because in one support group, there was a man even younger than me. He was in his 20s, and he had erectile dysfunction as a result of a radical prostatectomy, too. And in anger, he said to the support group, he said, if I knew that this was going to result in kinky sex the rest of my life, I would have never done this. So I'm looking at this and saying, oral sex is, it's really good. It's kind of like that frosting on the cake as far as our relationship would go. But when it's a steady diet and there's no alternative to it, then like everything else in life, we like to change our food, what we're eating, our variety, our vacations change, because that's a part of how we are human. And so for us, it became a routine. And when something becomes a routine, from my perspective, I don't live in a routine world. It became drudgery. It became a job. It became work. It was no longer as enjoyable as it was that first time after a long abstinence.
And at the same time, because it was the only way we knew to make love, it was a constant reminder of, this is all that we can do. We don't have any other alternatives. So, once again, we stopped making love. And every time we stopped making love, we started picking on each other. We started arguing. We started bickering. And it was obvious that our marriage was just going downhill. So finally, Keith said to me,
Well, one night we hit a really low point. Remember, this is a roller coaster we're on. You know, you go from survival to what is left of me, and we're going on. So one night, it was a cold winter night, and Virginia had come on to me with a real light negligee, and I rejected her. I just didn't want to go there. And I realized when I looked across the room at her that I just really deeply hurt my spouse. I mean, and it became clear to me that it's not about me, it's about we. So I did what I thought was the only manly thing to do and said, Virginia, would you call the doctor and make another appointment? We need help. So the caregiver here takes the lead.
So we went back to Dr. Barrett, and he said, okay, we have these injections, and they'll give you an orgasm, or they'll give you an erection just like normal. I thought, oh, this is good. Why didn't he tell us about this beforehand? So we get the injections, and we start using them. And the first time, Keith, he was supposed to get, that's right, he was supposed to get instructions on how to use them, but he couldn't wait.
I came back from a road trip.
He comes back from a road trip, and he comes downstairs, and he has an erection just like this, you know. And I said, Keith, what did you do? And he said, I gave myself an injection. And I said, you were supposed to get, like, instructions on how to do this. Oh, no problem.
It works.
Well, 4 hours later, we make a run to the emergency room from Winona, Minnesota to Rochester, Minnesota, because Keith is in terrible pain. So that's how this started. But
So we arrive at the emergency room, and the nurse on duty in the emergency room, she says, why are you here? I said, I have preopsis. She looks at me and she says, you're the third guy, you're the third old guy in here tonight. What is it, a full moon? And I said, they're thinking, man, if that doesn't bring it down, nothing will, but it gets worse. They put me in a side room, and in came a nurse, a flight nurse. She was in a flight suit, blue with a yellow scarf on, probably one of the most beautiful women I've seen in my life. And it didn't take me long to realize she had been set up. So she has a sheet of paper there, and she says, now why are you in here? And I said, I have preopsis. What's that? I said, it's an erection that won't go away. How'd that happen? I said, I gave myself a shot. She looked at me and said, why would you ever do that? You know, that's when I really knew this was a setup. This was her first experience with this, and the head nurse in the front moved her in there and they were probably out in the hallway laughing and that stuff. But the sad thing about it is that by the time she got through that check sheet, my erection had gone away. And it's probably hurt her ego. That's the first time in her life that she chased a man away just by her presence. But anyhow, so that was our experience. My first shot without instructions, rushing off to the emergency room, and
so we did continue to use the injections, and we used them for quite a while. And we kept having in our mind that this was just like normal. We had, doctor had said, and you have an erection just like normal. So, okay, we're going to be normal again, because that's what we wanted. We wanted to be normal again. Well, after time, it is not normal to have to give yourself an injection to have an erection. It's not normal that you actually shouldn't do this more than 3 days apart. You should wait a few days apart. So that's not exactly normal. It's not exactly spontaneous. It's not normal to have to take your injections and your medication with you when you're on trips, or when we visit our son and we have to put it in his refrigerator because it needs to be refrigerated. So it's not normal. And so pretty soon, again, we were up here, and now we're down here again because we don't want to use the injections anymore. And we stop again making love. And once again, we start fighting and bickering and picking on each other.
We recognize now that when we start bickering and picking on each other, we realize that we missed our Sunday date. Okay. When the injections, at one point during the injections, and I was really down in the dumps, went back to visit the doctor. By then I'd had another surgery, which actually was a fairly significant surgery, which turned out fine. But the primary doctor said, I think you're suffering from, mild depression. So we went and saw a psychiatrist, Virginia and I did. And he said, I don't think you're suffering from depression at all. I think you have a male dysfunction issue. We're going to recommend that you see the psychologist, the specialist in male dysfunction. My reaction to Virginia right away was, can a person make a living at this? Just male. I mean, there can't be that many people that are, in need of, that was just my total ignorance. But anyhow, so we met with I met with the psychologist, and he said, when you tell me about, when you see a pretty woman, does that catch your eye? I said, oh yeah, that hasn't changed. How often do you think about sex? I said, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 times an hour. That hasn't changed. That's, normally it. And he says, well, tell me what happens when you give yourself an injection. I said, well, this is kind of interesting because once I get an erection, now all of a sudden it's just like it was before. I'm paying attention to what's going on. I'm not thinking about golf or computers or things like that. And the task at hand is right there, and it's very enjoyable. And so he said, well, here's what's going on. So he gave me the interrelationship between the vascular system, the nervous system, that there's actually 2 stages to a male erection. One is the automatic part of it, like our hunger just kind of comes on us as time goes on. And so our hunger for sex has the same type of drive. It's different in different people, but that part of it has been damaged. It's not working anymore. But the second part of it, when you have an erection, there's a secondary nervous system that takes place in your body, and that's why you all of a sudden can change, and you're just like before. So he said, what you have to start doing is you have to start approaching sex more like a woman approaches sex. And I said, well, what's that? And I learned this, I think, from your presentations, June, over the years, is that women have a 3-step process or a 4-step process of approaching sex, and men have a 3-step process. We get an erection, insertion, ejaculation, or orgasm. So we're programmed to be almost spontaneous. Whereas our spouse, which probably is because there's an 18-year possible investment here every time a woman has sex with the raising of a child, needs to be in a safe place. It has to be it has to be desirable for her. There needs to be foreplay, whereas men generally require much less foreplay, if any. And so once I realized that part of it, then the psychologist said to me, he said, so what you need to do is, the difference now is that when you would get that knowing kiss before you go to work in the past, your body told you that dessert tonight is going to not be on the plate, but it's going to be a little bit different. Now, when you get that knowing kiss that you and your spouse are ready to have sex, you got to think about it. You have to prepare the place. You have to prepare yourself psychologically. Once I owned that understanding, that piece of knowledge, then my approach to sex was no longer I was missing something, but we moved from spontaneous sex to now to gourmet sex. So the approach to sex became a little bit different for me. And I think, hopefully, and I don't have to say hopefully, more desirable for you.
And so we're really not telling
Answer that.
Of course. We're not telling you folks anything that you don't already know. But it was a transition for us. And I realized, and Keith always felt that his libido had been affected from the surgery. And so he rarely initiated sex. And so I realized that I had to now become the assertive person, and I had to be more the seductress and make the invitation, and help set the stage. But one thing that was really critical for this was that Keith had to promise me that he wouldn't turn me away. Because in the past, when I would want to make love with Keith, he would say, no, I don't feel like it, or I don't want to. And so in order for this to work, it had to be two parts. I was willing to kind of be in charge of our frequency, but he had to not turn me away. And then the second thing that, and so for 5 years, everything worked fine. We used the injections, but we learned to make love differently. We began to be more creative, and we began to experiment. And I think the biggest turnaround was we were talking about it, and we were talking openly about it. And in some of the essays I write about now, I think when we were young, sex just happened, you know? We just made love. Now, it wasn't always good, but we made love. But now we really had to talk about what we wanted and what worked now and what didn't work and what you thought was going to work and didn't this time, but it did the last time. And that has continued to this day as we've had more surgeries and our bodies have changed, and now we're 70 years old. But that talking has really been the critical place of how we make love. And the other thing is that after 5 years, the injections stopped working. And we were perfectly fine, because we'd learned how to please each other in many different ways, and we didn't totally rely on having intercourse. And so we went for another 5 years not ever having intercourse. And then we decided, and I'm going to kind of fast forward this to leave you plenty of time to ask us questions. Then I had been reading about implants, and Keith didn't want to have another surgery, which was understandable. And I said, "What?" I said, "You know what, Keith? The infection rate has gone down. Maybe we should talk about it. It would be like frosting on the cake if it worked, and if it didn't, we would still know that we were okay." So Keith does now have an implant, and we use the implant, but not always, because that would get boring too. And we are now in our 70s, and our libido has changed, but we're willing to change with it. And I want to just say one thing, that that we vowed to each other that we would never ever again stop making love. And we say, in whatever way we want that to happen, and in whatever way that's possible. And so we know that just lying next to each other naked can be just as romantic and lovemaking as having intercourse. And I think I'm going to stop there. Is that okay?
Of course.
And let you ask us some questions.
So I understand that you, that you had some surgery yourself. Did that have any impact on the relationship between the two of you sexually?
Yeah, we were just talking about when Keith, when he was faced with prostate cancer, and he became impotent, but he didn't want to have the surgery because he thought he would be less than a man. And that was really hard for me to understand. I thought, who would ever think you're less than a man? Who would even know if you were impotent? But he was really concerned about his own self-image. And then I had a hysterectomy, and I had an ovarian cyst, and I was in a lot of pain. And when they said, oh, this needs to come out. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, while we're there, we could just take your ovaries and everything out. And I said, oh. He said, your other ovary too. And I said, oh. And he said, well, that one could get a cyst too. I said, oh, yeah, go ahead and do that. And so everything got removed. And then I went into a kind of a depression because I pictured my insides as a black hole, that all my femininity had been taken away from me and I'd let it happen. And I resented the physician because I thought I was vulnerable. And that was not a good time to make a decision like that when I was so vulnerable. So then I began to understand Keith's relationship with his masculinity and my relationship with my femininity. Yeah.
So I guess I wasn't like when you have your prostate removed. Obviously, it affects your ability to have an erection, but I wasn't really aware that it affected your desire level. Could you talk about that? And that's interesting for a lot of reasons. But
That's an interesting perspective because by now I've had enough organs removed in my body to realize that I think there's some personality and memory associated with all your organs in your body, that there's a much bigger relationship. But in the removal of the prostate gland, my testosterone levels are the same, if not excellent. But that's only one measurement. So if you want to measure noise, you can measure noise. But if you can't measure how that noise is received, if there's not a receptor for that testosterone, that goes back into our nervous system. I think that's what's removed in the prostate gland when it's removed. And so as a result, the automatic system that creates arousal in a person is gone. And when that's gone, sometimes when you lose something slowly, you don't miss it. When it's a light switch and it's turned right off, your subconscious is telling you something's different, something's wrong. The other thing is that in the lead up to the surgery, the counseling goes something like this. Most people don't have any side effects from the surgery, from a prostatectomy, or even radiation. That's what I was told, that's what cancer survivors have been told all along. And they said there's only like a 30% chance that there might be some complications. Now, we've spoke to thousands of people, survivors of cancer support groups around the country. And although that's a self-selected group that come in to listen to our talks about the subject, I'm of the impression that there's much more than 30% of the men have a life-changing effect from the radical prostatectomy. The people that have radiation actually after a year have the same impotence effect. So it's a much longer delayed reaction before they have it. I've met some people that said they've had a radical prostatectomy and they've had no side effect.
side effects meaning erectile?
Erectile dysfunction, yes. But at the level that I get that information back, it's kind of like when Virginia just said, I rejected her. And it sounded like, I'm a man, I rejected her. Inside of me, I didn't want to start something I couldn't finish. That's a total different dynamic than what the words are said that I said to her. So getting beyond that first step goes deeper. I know the question was, I didn't realize that libido would be attached to that. And so the question becomes, is libido a psychological thing, or is there a biological, psychological interface? And I'm in that school that says you remove, for example, when they did the Ivor Lewis procedure on me, which removed 7/8 of the esophagus and half of the stomach, they cut the vagus nerve. And there's just something about this gut feeling you have about certain things, that a certain drive that you can have. I don't have that certain drive anymore. I just don't have this desire to start new companies, and it's like I've been almost neutered in a sense, and I don't want to use that word. That's probably not a good. I'm changed, and I feel I'm changed because of the organs that have been removed, or
Less driven, maybe?
less driven. Yeah. Now, acid stomach can drive a lot of attitude and things like that. So, I'm a data point of one.
But the physicians all, at least at that time, said, oh no, it doesn't affect your libido at
Yeah.
all. But it definitely affected Keith's libido. And I agree, I think a lot of it is psychologically, emotionally, mentally.
Well, I think they are more intertwined. Certainly, the DSM-5 now recognizes for women, not so much for men, that it is almost impossible to disentangle arousal and desire.
Yeah.
We've always sort of thought it's different in men, but maybe not. They're more entangled than we maybe know or think.
For a period of time, we were adopted by the state of Massachusetts to speak in support groups throughout the state. And we ended up in a really small town in western Massachusetts at a library, and only one couple showed up. 2 people, one couple. And so now it's very much, this is our story. We are not social workers. We're not trained in, because usually when you have a small group, there's a lot more personal questions that are generally best answered by professionals. But it turns out that the man was diagnosed with advanced prostate cancer, and it had spread throughout his body, and he was given a diagnosis of 2 months before he was going to be, is his life expectancy. So they're in the process of shutting down their business, and in the discussion, it turns out that his spouse had a double radical mastectomy 5 years earlier. And they were not communicating. This was really they were in a very, very bad place. And so I asked her, I said, what did you do after your surgery for you guys to come together on this? Because he didn't want to deal with things. And she said, well, I've never let him see me. The lights have always been off. And I asked him, I said, how'd you feel about that? And he said, I felt like I was totally rejected. And so the only thing I could say then, and I don't know whether you said it, Virginia, and I, is that, and what are you guys going to do now? And they looked at each other with tears in their eyes, held their hand, and whatever time they had left in their life, they were going to enjoy that and work together on it. Instead of suffering their pain separately, they were coming together on it. And that was, and so when we've written a book, we never expect that we would impact some people's lives like that. But when something happens to us and a part of us is removed physically, that's only the beginning of the story. It's not the end of the story. That one meeting when we went back to the doctor, and the intern came in, and he was so happy that I'm cancer free, and he was just bubbling, and I'm sitting there in really, really pain inside of me that I feel like damaged goods. I just looked at him and I said, I don't know why you're so excited. I don't know what kind of life I have left of me anymore. He wasn't expecting that answer. He turned about and he left. And I kind of feel bad for the guy, but on the other hand, life is not exactly about the stitches coming out on time. It's about how do you recover your life and deal the cards that are dealt you. And so, but I'm sure this young man's going to be a great surgeon someday. Probably is, and that's what his gift is. Okay.
Keith, if you had to rewind the tape, and how would you rewrite the script for the surgeon approaching you at that time?
I like the Massachusetts approach. It was an experiment, and that's where when there's going to be a consultation on surgery or radiation, that the doctor says, I'm going to be with you till your body's healed, and the social worker, the psychologist is right there saying, and I will be there until you are healed. because I believe that you can't have one without the other. The other thing is that I don't think doctors, they know what they say, but they don't always know what the patient heard. And so Dr. Barrett could have easily have said, and we have things that can bring you back to maybe almost like normal. We just heard normal. Okay? So to sit here 30 years later, 20 years later and say he should have said this. But your question is really good. Malcolm Gladwell, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of him as an author in his Tipping Point. He was hired one time by insurance companies to say, can you predict which doctors are going to be sued? And the result of all of his research and his statistics, it says, I think it was 3 minutes is the difference. The doctor spends 3 more minutes with the patient, available and approachable with the patient. That made the difference between the doctors that were sued. Statistically, that's what came out of it.
And Eli, I'm going to follow that up a little bit, because when we talk to the medical students, not all of them are going to be surgeons. And I was just telling in our other interview, 2 years ago I was in a serious car accident, and I was in a wheelchair for 3 months, and then I came home and I was in, and even when I came home I was in a hospital bed. But anyway, I'm in this big rehab, in the hospital rehab, the 3 weeks I was in rehab in the hospital. And the room was bigger than this, and there were people that were in slings and amputations and all sorts of conditions. And I was looking at them and I was thinking, every one of you have been impacted in some way in your intimacy. I think it was day 3 that my first day in PT. And I decided that I wasn't going to say anything about our book or anything. And so I went through all of my rehab, all of everything. And at our 6 months appointment with our orthopedist surgeon, our orthopedist, he said, "Oh, okay, now you're discharged." And I said, my care here has been really, really good, and I'm walking, and I really appreciate everything. But there's one place that was really missing. Oh, what was that? I said, in all of this time, nobody said anything to us about me being intimate again. I said, now, to be fair, I have to tell you who we are. That wouldn't be fair to you. And he said, he was kind of a young guy, and he said, well, I've tried to say something to people, but usually they just seem embarrassed. And I said, well, I'll tell you what we tell the students at the University of Minnesota, that you need to bring it up, and you need to normalize it, and you need to say something like, almost everyone who's in this condition has concerns about their intimacy, about being sexual. If you ever have that concern, I'll be happy to talk to you about it. And I said, but don't expect them to ask you that day. Give them time to go home and talk with their partners about it, and then they may likely come back to you, and you should bring it back again. Oh, he said. And I think so. I think it's not only surgeries. Keith and I now say that we feel any time there has been a medical intervention, it has affected someone's intimacy in some way or another for some time or another. It could be very minimal, it could be a very short time, but it will have affected their intimacy. And I think it's just so often not addressed at all.
So I could listen to you guys for a long time. We in medicine have not done a good job in this area. A couple of observations. One, we've paid almost no attention to the patient. We have paid no attention to the partner. And that is a huge mistake. The second observation is we are an aging population. There are going to be a whole lot more of us in the years to come. And some of the things that we face are cancer, that's just one of the things, but we also can face cognitive decline. And we have done nothing looking at being intimate in that diagnosis, or even what you mentioned with the couple that you had who he is terminal. What do you see? Almost nothing in how do you continue to be intimate when you're dying of cancer? Because not everybody anymore is dying of cancer. We survive our cancer, but there are some who don't. And what do we offer them?
That's a good observation. There's one other thing I'd add on to what we said to Eli when I rewind. One of the things I've learned in being associated with the PHS program and the SARS program is that there's an upfront interviewing there's a question you can ask I think is critical. And the first one is, how frequent are you having sex? And the other one is, what's the intensity of your sex? How enjoyable is it? That becomes a baseline that a year, 2 years, 3 years, that the medical profession, whoever's given that survey, can look back on it and compare to where they're at now. And then over time, I think that can even be normalized to aging and other factors. But June, I think we're really at the, what I would call the leading edge or the bleeding edge of knowledge in this area. We're living longer. And our bodies are being diagnosed with things that are many times curable, some aren't, that haven't had the research body to work with. So I think you're at the beginning stages of this.
Our adult children knew, of course, what was happening. We were very open with them. They knew about the book. They read the book. They read the galleys. They helped us with the book. And I guess once you start talking about intimacy, as you all know, it's pretty easy to do. Matter of fact, you realize sometimes you shock people. But the most the most touching thing that has happened to me was 3 years ago. Our second oldest it was 4 years ago. Our second oldest grandson was 13. His name is Galen, and Keith had been out of town, and so Galen had spent the night at the house with me, and we had been out in the yard, and we had a really good day together, and we came into the house in the late afternoon, and I have no idea why I chose that moment to say to him, I said, Galen, you know that your grandpa and I have written a book. He said, yeah. And I said, do you know what it's about? And he said, kind of. And I said, well, Grandpa had prostate cancer. Yes. And I said, now he's cured of prostate cancer, so he's okay. And I said, Galen, do you know what the prostate is? Kind of. And I said, well, it helps make the semen. And when Morfar had his surgery, there were nerves that were damaged, and so now he can no longer get an erection. Galen's 13, and he said to me, that must make him feel really sad. And I said, yes, it did make him feel really sad. And it was really difficult for us for a while, but we're okay now. And so when people ask me about talking to children, I say, I wasn't embarrassed. Here was my 13-year-old grandson that had that empathy for his grandfather. I didn't need to go into details, but the door was opened and he wasn't embarrassed and I wasn't embarrassed. And I think we underestimate children.
We had that question another time at in Washington, D.C., we had been adopted by the health writer at the Washington Post, Abigail Trafford. And so she attended actually it was in Baltimore at Hopkins, a session with the social workers. And there was only one doctor that showed up for that. That was because he had just been diagnosed with prostate cancer. All the rest was about 40 or 50 social workers. But one of the questions came, how does your children feel about that? And it was very easy to say, well, there's my daughter sitting over here. She's been with us on this journey all along. And so, that's a very common question. How do your children feel about you being so open about your intimacy? In our discovery with our children is that I think if you're open with it, just like Virginia said, as a doctor, if you bring up the subject first, then you create that as a safe place to have that discussion.
Thank you.